How do you go about writing a philosophy paper for publication? How do you structure it, and what kind of length should it be? Let's take a look. Hello and welcome to Attic Philosophy. On the channel we're talking about metaphysics, language, logic, the mind, social issues. This is part 2 of a series of videos on writing and publishing in academic philosophy. In part 1, we looked at some basic questions about why you'd want to write an academic philosophy paper and the kinds of paper that you might write. In this part, we're going to look at 2 topics: the structure of your paper and how long it should be. So this was part of an advice session that I filmed for philosophy postgrad students, but whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope it's going to be useful to you. Let's now think about the structure of the paper, okay? Again, this depends on the kind of paper it is. So let's suppose you are writing a paper setting out your theory of whatever. So this is a typical kind of paper that you might be writing towards the end of your PhD time. You have done all your PhD work, you have worked out your own theory of whatever it is you're working, and you want to express that theory in a nice journal article. Okay, so a typical paper would go like this. Really short introduction, basically just saying what you're going to do in the paper and why. First proper section, you're going to concisely set out the problem, making it really clear why anyone should care about this. You don't have to worry about this too much in your dissertation. It doesn't matter whether people care about it or not. You're writing that dissertation, so, you get to choose what you write on. That's fine. In a journal paper, on the other hand, to some extent, you need to convince the editor, the referees, that it is an interesting topic for people to think about. Sometimes that's just obvious. If it's a topic that loads and loads of people have written on, it's no problem. But still, why should they care about your particular take on the topic? So if you're writing on, time. Obviously, time is a topic that people care about, but why do they need to hear more about time? Why do they need your paper? What's it going to add? You kind of got to get that into that initial section. But you've got to get it in there concisely, okay? Part of the trick to writing journal papers is you have to make your point, but you have to do it concisely because there's going to be a pretty severe word limit. So, intro, set out the problem. Then you're going to have to think about why, so a new section, why other approaches out there aren't good enough. So typically there are going to be other approaches on the market, okay? Why do we need yours? What is wrong with all of those other approaches? This can be a tricky one to express because if there's loads of different approaches, how are you going to talk about all of them? You've got to be pragmatic. Maybe you have to talk briefly about the most popular ones, the most recent ones. You have to say why that approach isn't the right one, so you have to give an objection to each one. It doesn't have to be a brand new objection. It can be a survey of existing objections, just pointing out that every approach or the main approaches out there have something wrong with them. If it's that survey kind of thing, so you're discussing other people's work, you've got to keep it really concise. So when I'm refereeing a paper, one of the things that often makes the difference between a paper that gets accepted and a paper that doesn't get accepted is this paper just goes on too long before it starts doing the novel original thing, okay? If you're halfway through the paper and all the author's done is really survey the territory and repeat what other people have said, I'm thinking, did we really need all that? Couldn't they have said all of that stuff in a more concise way by citing the literature, briefly referring to what's already out there, rather than kind of going into so much detail about it? But it's tricky because remember the previous point I made, you've got to make it clear at the beginning why anyone should care about your paper. If you just list out, oh, this person says there's a problem for that theory, this other guy says there's a problem for that theory, it might not be obvious to the referee that there really is a need for your new contribution. So you have this difficult balance to do there, okay? You've got to make it clear that you've got something new and worthwhile to add by showing that there's a problem with existing theories, but you can't go on about it for too long. Then you get to the section of the paper where you start to discuss your approach. Depending on how close or distant your new approach is to what's already out there, this might take more or less work. So sometimes a new approach can just be a matter of applying one theory from over here to this different problem over here. If that's the case, it can be relatively easy to write this up because you can refer people to the previous theory. You can expect maybe some familiarity with it. If, on the other hand, you are coming up with something pretty different, then your job's really difficult, because how are you going to get all of those new concepts across to this referee who basically hasn't encountered these concepts before? And how are you going to do that in a concise way? Your job there is much more difficult. So taking a theory and modifying it, working with existing stuff and building on it, is a much easier way of presenting a new theory than it is coming up with something completely new. So anyway, you might have one or two sections in which you present your new approach. So it could be you have one section which gives the basic idea and one section which gives the details. Or one section which kind of softens people up and then one section which kind of says, bang, here's exactly how it's going to work. You have to be super, super careful in those sections that you are expressing your new theory in the clearest way possible. And this is one of the most difficult things to do when you're writing your theory out for the first time. Basically, the way to practice that is by giving as many talks as you can. Present your ideas as often as you can to a wide audience as possible. That's kind of difficult right now, so we've got to use the PGR seminar, we've got to use online conferences, that kind of stuff. Basically, what you do is, in a talk, is you present your idea in the way you're currently thinking about it. You pay real attention not just to objections that come into it, but also to misconceptions about the way you're presenting it. Okay, so if people aren't really getting what you're trying to convey, you've got to go away from the talk and think about, right, how can I present this idea in my head in a clearer, more logical for them way? Once you've nailed it, that's the way it should look in your journal paper. Then you're at the back end of the paper. What you should be doing at the end is maybe considering briefly one or two likely objections. And here you've got to be careful, right? Because there might be the objections to your theory that you think of. They're not always the right things to include in your paper. Rather, you want to include the objections that the reader might have thought of. Objections or maybe misunderstandings. So again, by presenting your work in conferences, workshops, seminars, sometimes you'll find that objections or misconceptions or misinterpretations will keep coming up. You can have a section at the end of the paper in which you go through those and show why they don't hurt your theory. At the end, super brief conclusion in which A, you summarise what you did in each section, B, state your conclusion. So introduction, conclusion, super short. So that's a kind of a typical structure for a paper. How long should it be? There's a more or less kind of rough length a paper should be, at least when you're starting out. So I think good advice is on the Australasian Journal of Philosophy's instructions to referees. So what they're doing here, this is a really good top 5, top 6 journal, and they are instructing referees in the way they should think through whether that paper is accepted or rejected. So that's a really good thing for authors to pay attention to. So they say their bar for acceptance rises at 8,000 words. So they are happy to take papers that are longer than 8,000 words, but once you hit 8,000 words, the bar for acceptance goes up. Take that to mean If you're submitting to a journal like AJP, make sure it is definitely not 8,000 words. It's definitely below 8,000 words. Again, when I'm refereeing papers, one thing I'm looking at is how long is this paper? Two reasons for that. One is print journals are short on space and they like to keep things short. The other is you're asked as a referee to make a general judgment about, is this a worthwhile paper for a large number of academic philosophers who are short on time to read? So in other words, would you recommend this paper to your colleagues who work in that area to read? And if it's twice as long, I'd be twice as hesitant in recommending it, keeping the quality the same. So if you can get your ideas across doing all the things we just talked about in a shorter paper, it's better. It's more likely to be accepted. And by shorter, I mean under 8,000 words. 6,000 to 7,000 words, I think, is great. 6,000 is on the short side, 7,000 is medium, getting up to 8,000 is looking a little bit long. And I know you're going to read papers that are way longer than this, maybe, like 10,000, 12,000, but look at who the authors are. Look at the journals, okay? Are you yet that kind of author? Are you yet going to be writing in that kind of journal? I think until maybe a few years ago, I tried to make every paper 6,000 words. And the only reason I stopped and started writing slightly long papers is, I've got a safe job now. I'm not so fussed whether the paper gets accepted first time round, second time round, third time round. You guys, I guess you're going to be much more concerned with the timing of things. I'll talk about timing in a bit. You really want your paper accepted as soon as you can once you've written it, okay? So you can make your life easier there by keeping the length down. Aim for 6,000 to 7,000. So in fact, to get a little bit anecdotal, during my PhD, I found it really, really hard to get papers accepted. I'd got things accepted at conferences to give talks and then maybe some conference proceedings. And I thought, oh yeah, this is going well. Then I started sending things to good philosophy journals and everything just got chucked out. And often it wouldn't even get comments. It would just be like, this is nowhere near the required standard. One reason for that was I was basically writing kind of like you'd write in a dissertation, like I wrote at the beginning. I didn't appreciate how you had to write differently for a journal, but also I was just writing too much. So what I had to do was work out what was wrong with my writing, and often it was just that I wrote too much. And particularly in the early stages of the paper when I was setting things up, I was just going on for too long about other people's work, stuff that had already been covered, and I wasn't giving enough space to what was new and novel and original. Okay, so that length thing is going to be really important. When I have looked at PhD, early career philosophers' papers that they are going to be sending out to journals, one thing I kept seeing was basically this paper's too long. So even before I would read the paper, I would get in a conversation, paper's too long. 13,000 words, not going to get there. And we would get in a conversation where the author would say, you know what, I just can't fit my research into a smaller thing. If that's the case with you, because that seems to be the case with a lot of people early on, consider whether you've got one paper or two papers there. If you've done a whole bunch of research, if you've got maybe data, or you've got all this different stuff to consider, okay, maybe you do have to discuss all that stuff, but maybe it shouldn't be one paper. My gut feeling in a lot of cases is, yeah, you think you have to discuss all that, but you don't. Be really, really tough on yourself. Writing the shorter paper by cutting stuff out that you would like to talk about actually makes it a better paper and it benefits you in the long run. So what I did with my papers when I wanted to try to up the structure, up the quality, cutting stuff out, was I kept the structure to the kind of sections that I already talked about, and I made sure every section wasn't longer than 3 pages. Psychologically, I know nothing about the science of this, so this is just kind of, anecdotes and bad science, but it kind of felt right to me. A section is about a particular thing. When you're talking about something new, you move on to the new section. 3 pages feels about right. Okay, that's it for part 2 of this video. Thanks for listening this far. In part 3, we're going to talk about publishing your article. Where should you send it for publication? How long's it going to take? What should your expectations be? I hope you've enjoyed me talking about these kind of topics. If you have, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave me a comment below. It would be great to have your input. Okay, hope to see you back in part 3.